Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to have you here both at this studio and also 92.1, that's WFOV, and do a wonderful job over there at the other network that we're on Saturday mornings at 12 o'clock. Saturday afternoon, wouldn't it be, at that time. And that this program is preceded by Whose Opinion Is It Anyway? And I think that's a very good way of introducing this program, our format before that, and we're glad that we are partnering with that program as well as the network. Paul Herring, I want to commend you again for the fine job that you're doing. You are a visionary and a very important instrument here in the city of Flint. If you were not here, a lot of things that you're doing would not be done because of the fact that you are filling a lot of holes in the city. And we appreciate it here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to be partnering with what you're doing in your efforts. We were saying last week in our program that the shutdown has been mischaracterized, and those that are characterizing the shutdown as due to D.A.C.A, we would take some umbrage with that. I said that in the view that we have here at allpointstv.com, at least this program, what's going on is that the shutdown was a result of inflation, or it is due to the fact that the government ran out of money. If you are paying attention, you will see that they are admitting to that behind the scenes. And I want to read something that was said in the news last week that kind of highlights this point. It says here that the House joined the Senate in passing the bill to fund the government through February the 8th, reauthorize the Children's Health Insurance Program, and roll back several health care taxes. It passed 81 to 18 in the Senate and 266 to 150 in the House. And then this comment by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. I think these are ominous words, quite frankly. He says, "I'm glad we can finally get back to work here." And whenever the Congress is getting back to work, everybody can just simply pause and duck because it's the Congress getting back to work that is part of the problem in this country. Because what they should have said, what McConnell should have said, is that they are getting back to work in the country over. And they act like the government, quote unquote, shutting down. In this case, it shut down for 60 hours. But, the government shuts down anyway on the weekends. And so this idea of the government shut down, the government never shuts down. And if it did, it still would not be a crisis, because the government shutdown just means that the Congress is not meeting. And then all of the extenuating aspects to the government, to the Congress, all of its little the octopus type parts of it, the arms of the Congress, the arms of the I call it the deep state. That is, say, that part of the state that is not beholden to the American people for its existence. We didn't vote them in. We don't have anything to say about their tenure. We don't have any way of holding them accountable, because they don't come before us to have us endorse their presence. And we certainly do not have anything to say about their purpose once they get there. They are beholden to those that appoint them in those positions. So the voters have been, in a way, disenfranchised by their presence. And it's those persons that are, laid off that in 2013 they would, that when they had the so-called shutdown in that year, you remember that there were 830,000 federal employers who they call non-essential workers, who they put on furlough. And then after the shutdown, which never did take place, quite frankly, because the government, the ones that are elected to run the government, that is, say, those of you installed in office through your ballot, they did not leave, and they were not shut down anywhere. They were receiving their pay and nothing, and it went on as usual as far as they were concerned. But those that are in back of them, those they appoint in what becomes a deep state, out of the purview and out of the privilege of the voters, installing them into those offices and those stations in the federal government, all that stayed on the sideline during the shutdown. But those that we vote into the policy arrangement of the country, the president, the ones that the president, his cabinet, the ones he appoints, and the members of the House and Senate, they didn't go anywhere. And so how this is framed as a government shutdown is quite interesting to me, because the fact is that the government was intended to be small, and it would have those officials in it and the 4 departments that it had. So what was intended was limited government, where you have the House and you have the Senate, you'd have the president, you would have the Supreme Court, and you would have the cabinet that is authorized. And there were only 4 departments when the country was set up. So the government was supposed to be limited. And so what they're shutting down is all those aspects of government that was never intended in the first place. And then the Constitution in Article 1 says that Congress shall meet. Shall, now, the word shall means they're commanded by the Constitution. Congress shall meet at least once a year. So if they're only commanded to meet once a year, that means then the other 364 days of the year, they don't have to be there. So the Constitution is allowing it to be shut down.
It's like another thing is too. They go to D.C. after they're elected from the Congress or Senate. They go from the states to there. Seldom they come back to. They have offices here, obviously, but seldom. Like, how many stay there? I mean, how many stay there after they retire or no longer, they're voted out of office? They stay there. They become that culture there in D.C. They're like carpetbaggers from the onset. A lot of them just got their jobs, moved out, they're used as a stepping stone. They had no real concern about the area they were coming from.
They're carpetbaggers in Washington, D.C. They're supposed to be supporting they're representing their constituents. And so since their constituents are not in the nation's capital, but they're back home in those states where they are elected from, members of the House are inside the states and therefore inside the districts of the states, and the senators are representative of the states statewide. The 2 senators from each state. And so they are, John, that's a good word you use, they are carpetbaggers in the nation's capital. And so they should be going back home on a regular basis. What they really should do is shut the government down. I mean, the government's not going to shut down, but leave their offices and go back home and have regular town hall meetings on things that are coming up on a regular basis and find out what the voters think about it and what their feelings are, so they can go back into the halls of power and then vote those things that the constituents want them to vote into policy, to keep checking with them in regularity, so that the idea was meet once a year, but come back with the business of the people to enjoin that in the halls of power.
Me and my friends brainstormed one time on how to prevent them from actually just becoming so disconnected to their voting populace back home, and basically require them not to. They can't move to D.C. They have to. If they go to D.C. to do business, they should stay in a dormitory, and they should have specially built dorms, and they have like meeting rooms, and they have to sit there, and they cannot have any ex parte communication with anybody, like lobbyists and stuff. They have to everything has to be video recorded. Yeah. All their meetings. No golf course meetings, no dinner meetings, no junkets, none of that stuff.
Have a camera following them around in the nation's capital when they get there, and keep tabs on them while they're there to make sure they're not running off with their girlfriends. And we don't, once they're in Washington, we lose sight of where they are and what they're doing. And we can't hold them accountable unless we can have some way of knowing where they are and what they're doing while they are away from their constituents. But the idea of the Constitution requiring them to meet at least once a year and saying they must in fact do that at least one time, the implication is that this meeting of the members of Congress on a continuous basis was never intended by the framers. And also they weren't intended to be there all these years as career figures. These people never go home, and they never step down from power. I'm not saying never. When I say never, I'm not saying they never do it. I'm saying that it's never intended for them to be ongoing in their election into those offices that they hold.
Well, the only time they leave office is there's some the people just wake up, or they decide they're old enough and they just want to get out of there, or they have a better offer somewhere. They finally admit to being employed by somebody else other than them, other than their constituents. But I mean, let's be honest about it. I mean, that's why would you want to leave that situation where you got money flowing into your coffers? It's pretty much unchecked and unregulated.
They go there poor and they come out millionaires, and to give that power up, and that power brings about privilege. And it privileges the amount of money they can, in fact, put in their own coffers, because the politicians are enriching themselves, and they're doing that at the expense of the public. When we began to really understand what is happening in this country and what these politicians are doing to this country, if we could just become more cognizant of how we're not being represented, then the voters would then take care of the rest of it. We're not going to get good government until we begin to turn these people out with regularity. That's why Jefferson was right in what he said, that when government fears the people, you have liberty. But when you don't have that, by the very virtue of its absence, you have just the opposite of that. So if the people are feared by the government leaders, by the politicians, you will have liberty under those circumstances, because they understand that if you in fact frustrate the people's will, you're going to pay a political price for it. And I agree with Thomas Sowell, the great thinker, that said that the first priority of politicians is to get elected, and the second priority is to get reelected, and the third priority is to get reelected again. I don't know where we come into that picture. But if they fear that they are going to be held to account, under that fear that they will not be elected and reelected, will in fact cause government to become more responsible to the people, because they know that their terms will be limited through the ballot box. And I hear a lot of people tell me that we want term limits. I see that as the people calling for something that would make the voters disciplined. The voters have to be disciplined.
It have to be more. Let's face it, though, it's an arduous task to actually know what these guys are up to, because there's so many. The press doesn't recover. You can watch C-SPAN. You can watch it, but let's face it, the action is real slow. And let's face it, you see a lot of times the camera's on there. Most of the seats are empty. Just they're voting on something, or some guy's reading a bill or something like that. And it's like let's face it, it's anticlimactical. Besides, you don't get to the punchline. You don't get to where it went with that. So you basically should have a good synopsis. But look, the press doesn't cover that. They don't. They cover scandals. They cover sensationalism, but they don't cover the meat and potato issues. And it is boring. It is tedious. Just go to city council meetings and see that kind of stuff.
The framers put a great system in place here, but if it's going to be maintained, it's going to be maintained only if we become more diligent as a way of holding those to account that we elect. We just can't elect people and then leave it up to them to do the right thing, because politicians, just like anyone else, they represent their own interests. And if the people's interest is going to be carried out, it's because the people's interest is embodied in the interest of the politicians. In other words, the people will be looking out for their own interests, and therefore, doing that, they will in fact call the politicians to account to make sure that they are doing the people's bidding. The way it works, I'm going to be in Africa very soon here, and the way it works there in more ancient times is that they would send the politicians, when they wanted them to leave office, they would send them parrots' eggs. And the parrots' eggs would be sent to them to remind them that they need to leave because they are no longer parrots. That's what politicians are intended to be, if they're going to do that which is, if they're going to do their due diligence and do that which they are commissioned to do by the people putting them in power. If we're going to have government of the people, then the politicians must be parrots. All they do is parrot the will of the people. If they're not carrying the will of the people, but carrying out their own will, then there's no representation there.
But look at though, you when we get the candidates when they first start running, they come out with their positions on the issues. Now sometimes, but I think a lot of times people do have their own positions, but they look towards them as validating it, and as if they're not in accordance with this guy saying or this person saying who's running for office. I want to be inclusive. The person running for office, then they almost like they're chagrined and they're taken back. Then they also have to rethink their position. But yet the majority of the people should have an input. That's what they're supposed to listen to a larger voice, and they're voting your own conscience when you're a congressman. I hate when people say, well, he voted or she voted their conscience. I said, that's not what they're supposed to do. No, that's not what they're supposed to do.
John, they're voting their conscience. What conscience are we talking about here? Their conscience is doing things that cause them to be installed in power. After that, it's a free fall.
Well, Joe Lieberman always said that, they always said, like, Joe Lieberman, my friend prates this out. He said, he struggled with his conscience. He struggled with his conscience when he voted this. And my friend says, too bad his conscience didn't ever prevail. He always went along his party's line anyway.
Yeah. If we wait for them to do that, which is based upon their conscience, and the conscience would bother them, they don't sleep at night. They just stay awake at night, wonder if they did the right thing. And they come in teary-eyed and red. They have redness because they just worry so much about whether or not they did their best job during the day to carry out the will of the American people. Now, anyone who believes that's what's going on up there in Washington, D.C., I have some property over there in Siberia I want to sell you. That is not what they're doing. But the people got a responsibility here, and that is the fact that your responsibility is to hold these persons accountable. Don't assume they're going to do your will just because you installed them into power. And they have these nice sounding promises they're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it sounds very good to get them elected. And then when they don't carry it out, they claim that they were frustrated in carrying out the will of the people because there's some bottlenecks to put in place. Like this closure you just had last week, where they opened the government back up after voting cloture on this filibuster that went on in the Senate. But there's nothing in the Constitution that allows, that mandates that before anything is voted upon in the Senate, you must have a 60-vote majority in order to bring that to the floor. They created that. The Constitution, whenever it speaks to a non-majority carrying the day, it specifies in those cases specifically where that would not be the going rate. For example, in Article 1, Section 5, Clause 1, it says that in order to do the business of the House and the Senate, you must have a majority vote that would constitute a quorum. In other words, the people's business in both those bodies requires a majority vote. Now, when to carry out something that the Congress does and it does not require a majority vote, the Constitution specifies that. I said last week that if you, for example, wanted to impeach the president, you would have the Constitution requiring in Article 2, Section 4, it says that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers will be impeached, can be impeached, not shall be, can be impeached, for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. If you actually would impeach anybody for treason, a whole lot of folks would be impeached in the Congress, and Obama would have been impeached just on that basis alone. You know what's weird? Hillary Clinton would have been impeached.
So many of these things that we accept, I mean, they're just roles. They say this person said that, they did this, they did that. They don't question it. And a lot of this stuff could be called into question. Treason doesn't necessarily mean that you're handing the control of the country over to somebody else. It's meaning something that is violating the rules of which you're supposed to operate.
Yes.
People, they think, well, treason means you're handing it over to somebody else. It could be also construed as you're simply not following the established rules. And that's, or am I wrong about that?
No, you're right about that. And if that's why they put treason first, is because the country cannot function and it cannot carry out the constitutional claims if the people in power are undermining the well-being of the country. So they put treason first. But it says that in order to bring about the impeachment of someone that's in office that's creating treasonous acts, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, and it calls it high crimes, other high crimes and misdemeanors. In other words, those who are elected officials are in high office, and they cannot commit a low crime. Anything they do is a high crime, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. It takes a majority vote. But then when you impeach someone as in office, then because it goes to the level of removal from office, because it's more egregious and more serious, then it says that it takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate to in fact bring about the conviction of the offensive act. So you charge the official in the House, and then you try the official in the Senate. A majority vote in the impeachment proceeding, and then in the trial of the impeachment, it takes a higher vote, and the Constitution specifies that. When it doesn't specify what number of votes are required above a majority, then it means majority should in fact prevail. And they're trying to act like the government shuts down because they're carrying out some constitutional mandate. The Constitution does not require them to shut government down. And it certainly does not require them to shut it down based upon 60 votes being required to stop the filibuster in the Senate. The Senate created that. And the first time the government shut down was when the government shuts down. The government never shuts down. But the first time that they pretended the government shut down was in 1976. And in 1970, when they were, in a way, they shut the government down with these filibusters in a way. We don't see they shut the government down with this filibuster, but they created the filibuster around, 1805, 1806, somewhere around there, when Burr, Aaron Burr, he was under some indictment because of the duel between him and Alexander Hamilton. And when Burr killed Hamilton, there was some cloud over his head, and he was the one that actually started this nonsense around 1805, somewhere between 1805 and 1806, when you began to put these other strictures in place so as to frustrate the majoritarian view of the Constitution. The Constitution is a majoritarian document. But when it moves away from that, it specifies in those cases where there will be some exception to the rule of majority having the voice, then it will in fact specify when that will occur. Because then you're going into something much more serious. And it's very serious to come behind the voters and then declare you're going to take those who are voted in by the will of the people, you're going to take that person out of power. That's a very serious matter. At that point, the ante is picked up because of the seriousness of that particular effort, and therefore they specify 2/3 vote is required in that case where you're going to frustrate the voters' will, because we should have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I don't think anybody will make that case given what's happening in Washington right now. But the shutdown that they had, the government never shuts down. And if you say that it shut down for 60 hours starting on Saturday mornings, when at 12 o'clock Saturday morning, at 12:01, the government, quote unquote, shut down, according to what they're saying. Nobody faced anything they would not have faced if the shutdown not occurred, because only the ones that would have, and the one that were furloughed are the one. This is why it had to be opened back up before the outrage would have set in, because the ones that have been furloughed would be, for example, those who are in the military. And I want to take exception to those that are saying that the Democrats, back down. That's not what happened either. What you saw there is that the Democrats did not back down, they reset. They reset because they were out there on thin ice, having this position of we are not going to vote for the finances needed to run the government in its whole holistically run the government, they were saying that they were not going to allow that to operate holistically, part of which include the military. And those of you that went to this movie called 12 Strong, go look at that movie. It's about the military over there in Afghanistan. And that movie, that's a great movie. Go watch that movie and see what people coming out of that theater were saying when that movie was over. I went to the movie and saw it yesterday, and I'll tell you what I was hearing, and because we out in the lobby, we were so moved by the film that we were discussing it out in the lobby of the theater. And I'll tell you what I heard people saying is that to talk about furloughing and not paying our military when there was not one member of the House and one member of the Senate getting paid. Not getting paid. Okay, we're going to take a break right now with 92.1. We'll see you in 4 minutes, and we're very glad to have you here. With allpointstv.com, we are going to continue what we're doing here. And don't worry, when they have a shutdown, don't think that there's something that's going on that's going to be something that puts you in jeopardy, because they are meeting more regularly than they were intended in the first place, and none of those guys left. You probably noticed none of them went home, and they got their pay, and just try to convince me that they could have sustained this. But the Democratic Party didn't back down. What they did is they reset. If you think there was a back down, let me read this to you. This article came out last Tuesday of last week. And the article is talking about, let me read this to you here about this article where it's talking about this so-called shutdown of the government. It says that the House joined the Senate in passing a bill to fund the government through February the 8th, reauthorized the Children's Health Insurance Program, and rolled back several health care taxes. It passed 81-18 in the Senate and 260-150 in the House. And what they're saying here is that the government, quote unquote, was opened back up so as to fund the government through February the 8th. I said it's a reset, because what the Democrats now have is, rather than shutting the government down over D.A.C.A, they now have, as of February the 8th, they're going to claim an agreement that they have with the Republican Party to talk about D.A.C.A, and therefore, if the government is shut down after February the 8th because there's a failure to get an agreement, then the claim is that the Republicans didn't keep their word. So D.A.C.A will be taken out of it, and now you bring the Republicans into, you agreed for the opening of the government back up, and now after February the 8th, the agreement was in fact violated, and McConnell did not keep his word, and therefore that's the basis of the shutdown. It's a sleight of hand trick by these guys who are masked. These are very shrewd, operators. Shrewd operator, that song, shrewd operator. Yeah, that's what they are. They're very shrewd. And they operate constantly in front of the American people, but behind their back at the same time. No government shut down. And they're not going to shut the government down. What they're going to do is they're going to hold the government in ransom, and they're ransoming off the liberty of the American people, because you shouldn't have anybody putting the privilege of non-citizens ahead of the citizens of the country. And they were trying to cover up what the real deal was, and the real deal is that they were cutting off the funding of the government had in fact expired as of 12 o'clock Friday night. So at 12:01 the next morning, on Saturday morning, they ran out of money. And I said that the government was shut down because of inflation. Whenever the government borrows money to operate, then the borrowing of money is inflationary. And eventually you run out of that money. And what they didn't do was raise the debt ceiling to borrow more money. And where are they borrowing this money from? They're borrowing this money, they claim China, they're borrowing money from the American people. We're back with 92.1. We're glad to have you back. I want to thank you for coming back after the 4-minute hiatus. and we're not very far from where we were when you took your break. And we're still talking about this shutdown that occurred, which was never. There's never going to be a shutdown of the government. I wish that were not the case, but I mean, sometimes the government needs to get out of here so that we'll have a respite for them taking our liberty from us during the time that they're no longer meeting. But they don't ever shut the government down. They simply furlough some of the people. But what was unconscionable here was the furlough would have been those that are out there in the armed services, and the Democrats understood that they would get the blame for it since they were saying this was a Schumer shutdown. They were trying to blame it on Donald Trump. And Donald Trump not even in there negotiating anything. You put the bill that you passed on the president's desk, and if he in fact doesn't sign it, then the president's stopping that from going forward. But in terms of the deliberations, that's not the president that's discussing that. That's the members of the House and the members of the Senate. And they're trying to bring him in there because they want to make it unpopular. This president is in fact shutting the government down. When he said there was a Schumer's shutdown and creating some clarity here, then the Democrats out there saying that they would in fact shut the government down and not pay the soldiers, for one, because of something that has nothing to do with citizens of the country, and they could not be out there like that.
You know, how many millions of people are in the armed forces? So if they can demonstrate that these Democrats are willing to forego paying the military personnel, it's not going to affect the personnel, but their families, their friends, associates,
That's
people are.
Point.
So guess what? They're saying they're so willing to just throw away that voting plot. I mean, it's just absurd. I mean, I remember Adam Smith talks about in Wealth of Nations, Inquiry to Wealth of Nations and stuff. He actually said the group of, when a group of capitalists people get together, business people, they're always, the public's interest is always in peril. Well, these people, the politicians, even far more directly and also arrogantly, because everything they got comes from us. They don't try to. They have no skin in the game really, other than their campaign trails stuff, and we basically somebody else backs that because they pay for them. So if these people want to be so critical of capitalism, they should also be very critical of these lawmakers.
These lawmakers are all socialists, because they want to have government making the decisions when the people should be in charge of it. And that is a laissez-faire intention that is implied in the Constitution. Ayn Rand is right in saying that the Constitution implies capitalism. The framers did not make it explicit, but the implications of the Constitution is hands off, government hands off. I
had a guy one time argue with me and try to tell me that the Constitution, the founders were actually more socialist leaning, and they wanted public works like welfare. And when I started, I got kind of outraged by that when I started thinking about they didn't allow for the collection of income tax until the 1900s. The country started in the 1700s, so late part of the 1700s. So I mean, how could that be actually even intelligently entertained that our founders wanted to be a socialist state? That's just absurd.
Well, you mentioned Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations. Wealth of Nations is since Adam Smith is considered to be the father of capitalism, then that book, Wealth of Nations, is written in 1776. And so how is Karl Marx is 1848 with his book, The Communist Manifesto. So how are these persons socialists when the capitalists writing, the father of capitalism, was writing the book in the same year as the Declaration of Independence? And the frustration of government was to be that which was put in the Constitution that restricted them from getting involved. As long as that was the idea, it wasn't so much in writing, it wasn't explicitly made, but it was implicit in the government being kept small. So how could it interfere? It didn't have the resources to interfere. And it wasn't until 1913, with the passage of the 16th Amendment, which was the power to tax income. There was no income tax on the federal level. Only the states could, in fact, tax income. It was prohibited in terms of direct taxes in Article 1, Section Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It was direct taxes were prohibited in the Constitution. And so what happened was in 1913, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 was repealed in the Constitution, which allowed for the federal government to directly tax income in this country. And that's where the explosion in government largesse took off at that point. But before that, it was not allowed. And by government being limited, it necessarily, therefore, took the government's hands off of running the economy. The businessmen were running it. And the people that the businessmen were, in fact, serving were running the country. The power was in the hands of the people. And the government took it away from the producers and away from the consumers and put it in the government's hands. I don't know if you can relate. Some of you, the older person who listens to the program, can relate to this. But at one time, when you ran out of resources in your own house, the person that supplied those resources were the ones that were next door. And you knew exactly who were the ones that were doing goodwill in the community because they live right around you. You go over next door and borrow a cup of flour, go over and borrow some eggs, get some sugar from the person across the street, and you knew who those persons were that were your benefactors. And that, by the way, was what kept you out of their houses, because you knew that if they had anything that you needed for making up the difference in your resource base and what their resources were, all you had to do was go over there and ask them for it. And they took that away from those communities and put it in the government's hand by taxing the wealth out of the people's hands, and then they started doing that for political reasons. A lot of this breakdown of order we have in the society is because of that. These politicians are dangerous.
One other thing is, too, though, I looked at, and I tried to understand why we allowed the government to get so much of an upper hand in our lives. And a lot of it was done because we allowed like the establishment of a welfare state, because we saw the need of it. We thought we saw the need of it, and we just let it run. And we were so willing to be compassionate, we didn't put any checks or balances or anything. They initially did, but then they scooted them further and further away. So there's no kind of consistent follow through on all that stuff. So we just allow them to do this for our own good. We got into wars because we allow these people to make permanent alliances with people who basically the political landscape in most countries changed, but now we're tied to them. So I mean, and Washington warned about making political alliances permanent. He said, don't make them permanent. But we do that all the time.
We do it all the time. And John, these persons are very good propagandists. The government lies all the time, and they put these nice sounding phrases around what they're doing, so who can complain about it if that's what the policy is designed to be about? If the purpose is to create a great society, for example, with Lyndon Johnson, he's going to create the great society. So then what does he do? He goes into the treasury and gives people money they have not earned. He bases it upon the welfare state, and you create this dependence upon government. Is that a great society? Are we better off now than we were before Johnson put his policies into place? Which really was an extension of what Roosevelt had done, because Johnson was a protege of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this welfare state was an extension of the New Deal. So are we better off now because of that? No, we are a society that is in fact dependent upon the government for largesse, rather than getting the government out of the way and letting the market determine the resource base of society. Because the market is a merit-based system, not a government-based system.
Should be, and I really value the criticism people have about the crony capitalism or mercantilism, as Adam Smith would say. And they just change names. The setup's essentially the same. Getting the mercantilist, they got the government to back their endeavors by the might of the empire, and then they had the capital. They monopolize that entire realm, like trade or whatever. That's basically what the corporatists are. There's no crony capitalism. It's all the same. Just different names for the same entity, really.
They want to call it. Crony capitalism, but that is the capitalism is market based. It's government hands off. It's laissez-faire economics coming out of France. And some of you can recall when they had the treasurer of King Louis the 14th, who was interfering in the economy, and the people were trying to push them back off of their intrusion into the economy, and they were very dissatisfied with what was going on here, and they said, well, what can we do? And the producers in France said, you can leave us alone. And that's where this laissez faire came from, laissez-vous faire, which means you can leave us alone. And we had leave us alone in this economy all during the 18th century when the Declaration of Independence was written, in the 19th century when we drew up when the Constitution was being, well, the latter part of the 18th century, but when they were putting into place the strictures of the Constitution and then refining it, they had laissez-faire as the government's role in running the affairs of the country. Government was to be very limited, very small, and have his hands off, and have the producing class to make the determination and be the influences in society. But those that have political power and those who have guns are not willing to do that for long. They find some way of frustrating the limitations placed upon their power. And the framers did their job. This one guy last week from Louisiana, John Kennedy, no relationship to the ones in Massachusetts, but the senator in Louisiana said that this country was founded by geniuses, and he's right. Ayn Rand would endorse that idea, and does so in a book called The New Intellectuals. She says that the founders were the first intellectuals in this country, and so far as last intellectuals. She's she's dichotomizing intellectuals from scholars. Some scholars are something different. Intellectuals are something that create. Some intellectuals are people that create knowledge out of whole cloth, and do that which has never been done before. That's intellectual. A scholar is a person that studies what the intellectuals have done.
They do the scholar studies the postmortem of the intellectual.
That's it. Exactly.
That's a postmortem. They're looking at the corpse,
picking up the skeletons of the intellectuals. But they are the people that to understand what they did. They don't really create anything on their own. So those persons in the university are scholars. They're not intellectuals. The scholars were the founders of this country. So he says they were geniuses, and they were geniuses. They did something that the world had never seen before. George Washington was something the world had never seen before. A president of a country with his powers limited. Where had that ever happened before? We'd never seen it. Well, so he's right in saying they were geniuses, and he says, but the country today is being run by idiots.
See, Washington, I think, did pick up something from ancient history, Cincinnaticus or something. He reasserted, he came to power, he got things in order, then stepped away. He had to do that twice. Washington was very similar in that. I think he used him as like a role model or example, but let's face it, it's the power, the allure of power, that the financial gain potential is like astonishingly powerful. I mean,
and that one thing that he did, John, was what made him great. When you step down from power, and you don't have to, when people are trying to throw power at you, and you understand that the verdict of the people was to send you there to not be King George III, and you honor that because they had just gotten through fighting George III, and to honor that verdict of putting you in there, not to duplicate and not to exercise monopolistic power, to do that and step down from power was in fact shocking to the people. They were trying to throw him into a kingship. Some of the ones that were the voters. Some of the people themselves, though, wanted, I'm not talking about the people that were the money class in the country. The people themselves wanted the government limited because they saw how it had, in fact, antagonized their own interests as people who love liberty. They came here because they wanted to gain more liberty. And to have that taken from them, they fought to get King George III off their back. And George Washington understood that, respected that, and after he served 2 terms, although the money interest was trying to maintain him in power, George Washington stepped down, and that makes him great.
I read somewhere, incidentally, when I was a kid, I don't know if it's been verified, maybe you heard this or not, George Washington was a distant relative to George III. That's what I've read.
I read that too. I haven't many been verified.
Yeah, verified that too, but I got a book on the British monarchies. Yeah. It's like a great book, and I'm going to check that out, but that's what I read. Yeah.
Well, and it's amazing how many of them are related in those corridors, because they marry in, they're endogamous in terms of marital arrangement. You don't find very many persons with wealth marrying a pauper. I don't know. I don't even know if Prince Harry, would be marrying what's her name? The one he's getting ready to marry.
Meghan Markle or something like
Yeah.
that.
Markle will be, if she were not some actress of some note. I mean, she has standing, not royal standing, but she has standing. I don't think you would have someone doing the Cinderella story, where these persons that would go out there and somebody that's sweeping floors and have no standing would be marrying in these royal families. And even Markle has some problems because there's some objection on the part of Queen Elizabeth II, not to stop the marriage, but it's not like they got open arms about it, because what is her standing? Well, she does have some standing because she's not, I mean, she got her own thing going, and so it's not like marrying outside of, a certain class. The class structure is the same, although the standing in terms of royalty would be different.
Well, another thing, she's an actress, and there's always kind of a reluctance, or they didn't like it. I mean, the people who were actors and actresses in the time of the Queen Elizabeth I were kind of like a marginalized group of people. They weren't well respected. They were considered untouchables, basically, essentially.
That's why I wouldn't question that George Washington would have been related, because that's how power's always been. You could go back and look at it in the ancient times. You'll see that royalty married into royalty. So that the idea they would be related would not shock me. I've not checked it out myself.
Well, but I
have read that was the case.
The combatants of the First World War, the King of England, which was Elizabeth's father, I believe, and then also the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany are all first cousins to each other through Queen Victoria of England.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was the cousins fighting each other.
Yeah.
Basically.
In fact, George III was the first of the Georges that was able to speak English. They were speaking German. George I and George II. In fact, George III's wife, Queen Charlotte Sophia, came out of the Hanover. That was a German-based marriage that was there. She was royalty there, and she came over into the royal family there. And out of that came the 15 children that Queen Charlotte had with George III, and the 15 children, 9 boys, 6 girls, out of which one of them was Edward VI. Edward VI was the father of Queen Victoria. So that royal line, because that's how royalty is. Royalty marries into royalty. But you see it in the ancient world all the time. So it's nothing. I would not be surprised at all if there was some relationship between George Washington here and George the George III in that family line, because of the way that they would arrange marriages. But I give George Washington the total credit for being great in this country. I don't think politicians are great. Mount Rushmore is another lie. This began to create in 1925. We had gone through 30 presidents at that time. Calvin Coolidge was president at that time, and we had gone through 30 presidents, and they weren't able to find 4 presidents who had done great things in the presidential office to put they put up there on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. You tell me what are those presidents doing up there with the great George Washington? And I'm including that. I'm also including in that Abraham Lincoln, whom they lied about in terms of why he's up there as the great emancipator, which never happened in this country. And if there was emancipation, then why did the Congress then, in December of that year, after George Washington had died, after Abraham Lincoln had died on April the 14th of 1865, the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves in this country occurred in December of 1865, and that's 8 months after the death of Abraham Lincoln. So somebody's lying here. But he's up there for that reason. And they couldn't find 4 presidents to put up there of standing that belong up there on that memorial. The only person that belongs up there for the presidency is George Washington. Jefferson's up there because Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. But that's not because he's president.
Because if you actually look at what he did immediately when he became president with the Louisiana Purchase, he violated the same principles he stated he believed in when the country was founded.
Yes.
So he already forgot his roots or forgot what he was espousing just a few years before.
The framers were just what John Kennedy said. We had geniuses as those who wrote the documents that govern this country. They were not great politicians. Politicians are not great. Politicians are basically they feed on the production of the country. You see the extremes of it in Venezuela, because that's what they do. They consume the production of the country. They are the consumers of wealth. They're not the creators of wealth.
They use wealth that they can abscond with other people using force to woo voters to keep them in power.
Yes, and if people understood that, when they talk about a government shutdown, if that really would be the case, that's a good thing. Because government has to create crises in order to create their own relevance. If they don't create crises, the irrelevance would be known. They're basically irrelevant, and that's why the Constitution says that they must meet once a year. They do not intend to be there up there in Washington meeting every day. They don't need them up there in Washington meeting every day. They need to be back here listening to their constituents, but they don't want to come back here because the constituents are hollering at them now. You know, they go back there and have a town hall meeting, and what is happening is that these people are having chaos in those meetings, because the people are waking up now to what these persons are in fact doing. And what they are not doing is representing their constituents. They're not parrots. If they were parrots, there'll be no problem, because the people know best. The politicians are supposed to be parrots of the people, government of the people. And therefore, the politicians are supposed to be the people's parrots. That's why you send them parrots' eggs, because you are parroting the views of your constituents. And they're not doing that. They're talking about government shutdown as if we're supposed to be surprised or shocked by it. We are to be horrified by the fact that they are shutting the government down, and they didn't shut anything down except shutting down paying these people who are out there serving in their country, such as the people over there in the foreign land sent there by the politicians, and these persons will shut down their pay. And they knew they were out there once that becomes clear. If it had become clear that those 12 strong, go look at that movie.
Didn't Obama,
I was mad the whole time the movie was on.
Didn't Obama actually say he wanted to cut the insurances for the people in the military, saying, well, they signed up, they knew what they were getting themselves into? That's glossed over. I mean, that's, somebody threw that the other day in a posting. I think I recall him saying that, or something very similar to that.
Well,
and you're the one putting him in harm's way with your action, but then you want him to make do with what they can do, right?
Yeah, Donald Trump was commending this one soldier, the one in Florida, the one that Frederica Wilson made such a big hullabaloo over, as if he was trying to disrespect this woman whose husband had gotten killed in Niger. He was saying that you could take some you could take some condolences from the fact that your husband knew what he was getting into. In other words, you can be very proud of him, that knowing that he knew the dangers, but he wanted to serve the country, and you can take some condolences from the fact that your husband knew what he was getting into. He wasn't blindsided. He knew the mission was dangerous. And in that movie called 12 Strong, I would like everybody to go see that movie. What those persons did in Afghanistan, and that's a true story of what occurred. That was supposed to have been something that took place over the course of years. They did that within about 21 days. What they accomplished over there and the dangers they went through and putting their lives on the line, it is unbelievable what they accomplished, representing the politicians who sent them there. And they volunteered for a very dangerous mission and went over there and put their lives on the line. You tell me how you're going to furlough their pay and stand before the voters in the election year. They couldn't do it. So this idea they backed down, they didn't back down. They reset the terms of the shutdown that will probably be re-instigated on February the 8th. Because if the shutdown occurs after February the 8th, because this funding only goes on now until the 8th of next month. The D.A.C.A comes up on the 5th of March. because when Donald Trump ended DACA, he gave them 6 months to put the House in order to carry out the fact that DACA no longer exists. So they got into March the 5th, because Donald Trump ended it on the 17th of December and gave them a respite from December the 17th to March the 5th to institute this policy. So they got until March the 5th to fix it so that they can do whatever with the mandate. But DACA has been placed on hold by the president because this president believes in putting America first. And there's nobody in their right mind that would object to that, because the country is the citizenry is the people who live here legally in this country. Those are the citizens. And the non-citizens are those who break into this country, whom these politicians want to serve their interests, because they know that if they do that, they'll vote for them in the upcoming election. If they came in here as Republicans and they vote for the Republican Party, Democrats will shut it down. And I'm not saying anything good about the Republican Party. Because they come here as Democratic voters, the Republicans want to shut it down. They're just working out of their own political interests. But the interest of the country is legal immigration, because then you're respecting the country and the rights of the people to, in fact, impose laws upon those who are here for other means. Nobody should be in this country that would be here having come into the country for underneath the laws of the country. And we must, in fact, hold our politicians to account for that. But the reset occurred, and not a backing down. You just reset the terms of the shutdown, and we'll see what happens as of March 8th. Okay, we got to get out of here. We're glad that you are staying tuned to all the programs here at allpointstv.com and also 92.1, and we'll see you again next week. Until that time, I want you to follow your dream. If you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.